let's talk for a minute about the major reactions that most of us have with grief and what those are. And there's a lot of them, but we're going to talk about three today. And the first one let's talk about is anger. That good old red hot thing that most people want to avoid and run away from. Yeah, now why anger? Well, anger basically is an emotion that fuels our stories. Our stories are energized by the anger, and it's the stories then that help process that anger and start breaking it up a little bit, help it to dissipate a bit. But it works both ways. The anger sort of brings the grief sort of dissipates the anger as we are able to tell the story. Let's take an example. There was a friend of mine who did an international workshop, and the last day of the workshop, he was informed that one of the members of his workshop, a guy from South America, his brother had died. So my friend had to tell the man that his brother had died, and the man gave my friend a very odd instruction. He said, you know, what I'd like you to do is get 6 men and some pieces of cloth and meet me in the parking lot. My friend was a little bit struck by that, but he said, okay, that's what I'll do. So he got 6 guys, he got some cloth, he met them in the parking lot. The man proceeds to take the cloth and bite down on it with his teeth. Then he instructs my friend and the 6 men to hold him in various places so that he was restrained by 6 men. As soon as he felt the restraints were in place, he started to struggle. And my friend was kind of freaked out. At first he was thinking, hey, what are we going to do here? So what they did was they just held him back. And he said, just hold me no matter what. And they held him, and they held him, and they held him, and he struggled, and he struggled, and he struggled, until finally, after what seemed like 6 years to my buddy, but was probably, you know, a couple of minutes, the guy crumpled up in tears. Isn't that a beautiful thing? He used his anger as a means to connect in with that pain and loss. And for some of our population, anger is a safe way in. It's a safe way in. You know, the men, for instance, are oftentimes more allowed to be angry than they are to be sad. What do we call a sad man? We call him a wimp or a wuss or whatever. Who knows what you call him in Ireland. But we have some name for him. And I'll bet all over the world they have names for men who have a lot of sadness. So men will oftentimes use their anger as a means to get into that sadness. And they use the emotion that's given to them to move into the one that's shamed. And what's interesting is with women, you can see just the opposite. When I've worked with women over the years, and she'll be crying and crying and crying, and I'll look at her, and what I hope is the right time, I say, can you tell me what the tears are about? And she'll look at me and she'll say, I'm angry. And I kind of, whoa, okay. It shocks me just about every time it happens, but it happens a lot. What's she doing? She's doing the exact opposite of what this other man did. She's using her accepted emotion, which is the tears and the crying. People kind of accept women being like that, to move into the unaccepted realm, the anger. So both men and women are using their strength to move into that which is shamed. I think that's kind of interesting, don't you think? But what is anger? What is it? What's it made of? You know, if you look at what it's made of, you can do a whole lot more with it. Because really, when you break anger down, it breaks into 2 components. Expectation and hurt. Expectation and hurt. We expected something to happen that didn't, and we feel hurt in response. Think about the last time you were really pissed off, and I'll bet you that you'll be able to plug in and go, oh yeah, I expected her to do that, that, and that, and when she didn't, it was like that was disrespectful to me, and I felt hurt in response to that. So one of the boons for relationships really is to break your anger down into expectation and hurt. So when you go to someone and say, you know, I expected X, Y, Z would happen, and I felt hurt that it didn't, people respond, really? Is that right? But if you took the exact same emotion and went to them and said, I'm angry, what are they going to do? They're going to run. So in a way, it's kind of making it safe for everyone to break it down to its component parts, which is expectation and hurt. But a lot of times, you know, when we're working with people who are grieving, they're not going to be nice about it. They're going to be really angry, and you know what? That's okay. My mentor, Bill Wimp, used to say, tell a story about a woman he worked with who he would go out, he was a priest, and he'd go out to her house when she was grieving, and each time he went there, he'd notice that she was driving up and down the driveway, up and down the driveway, and Bill didn't say anything at first. He didn't say anything the second or third time it happened, but the fourth time it happened, he said, I'm just curious about your driving up and down the driveway. What's going on with that? She said, oh. She said, well, every day when I come home, I go to the mantelpiece. I get some of his ashes, and I take them out to the driveway. I put the ashes in the driveway, and I run over the son of a bitch every day. Was she angry? Yes. Did she have expectation of hurt? Most likely. But Bill said, that's good grief. Yes, and in some ways it is good grief, but in some ways it's not. Because one of the things we need to do is to be able to tell the difference between two things, between what is anger and what is hostility. You know, and those two need to be separated. So many people are confused about this, and so many times what you see is people feeling completely entitled to be furious, and they become hostile instead. They're not really angry, they're hostile. You know, angry is, I'm angry that such and such. That's an I statement. I am angry. That's anger. You're a jackass is hostility. Can you tell the difference between the two? One is taking responsibility for our internal state. I'm angry about this. I'm angry about that. The other is pointing the finger and saying, you're the jackass. There's something wrong with you. Hostility is no good. That doesn't help anyone. We need to help people differentiate between the two, because anger is okay. Let that flow. The more you work with the anger, the more the anger's there, the more it's going to dissipate and fall by the wayside. Hostility, not so much. It's not going away. The more you encourage it, the more you're going to get. So being able to tell the difference between those two is a real blessing. And encourage people to be angry. You know, angry is okay, but not conflate the two. You know, so many times I've seen people say, I'm angry that you're a jackass. And then they say, wait a minute, you can't talk like that. I have a right to be angry. Yeah, but you don't have a right to call him a jackass. Okay, so we're getting a little bit off topic here, but that's really okay. So for some people, anger is a way to move into the safety and to move then into the tender emotions. And the more we can kind of work with that, the more we can let the anger chip away by taking a chunk out of the belly over and over and over again, the more that anger is going to come down a little teeny bit at a time, and that's exactly what we want.
The Inuit tale of how people first learned to cry. One day, first man went out seal hunting along a seashore. He saw many seals. He chose a seal and carefully crept up behind it, but with a splash it tumbled into the water. He looked around and found another seal, and he crept up towards it even more carefully. But just as he was about to reach it, it too splashed into the water. This went on and on and on. At last there was only one seal left on the rocks. Man thought that this time he would be so quiet that the seal would notice nothing. But as soon as he began to move towards it, it slid off the rocks and swam away. Then man stood up, and in his chest he felt a strange feeling. The strange feeling seemed to fill all the space in his chest. Suddenly water began to run from his eyes. The drops of water ran from his eyes and down his face. When he felt them, he put up his hand and felt some of the drops. He looked at them. They really were water. Then, without knowing what he was going to do or without wanting to do it, he felt loud cries breaking from him. As he headed for home, the loud cries continued, and the water went on running down his face. When man's son saw him coming, he called to his wife and to his mother. "Look," he said, "here comes man making a strange noise." When man came closer, they were all surprised to see water running down his face. But after he told them the story of the seals, they were all stricken with the same strange sickness, and they began to wail along with him. And this is the way people first learned to cry.
First man knew a lot about this thing called sadness, and he was open to it, as was his family. Unfortunately, in our culture, we're not nearly so open. In fact, we're pretty primitive when it comes to our dealings with sadness, since we kind of see it as toxic, and we see it as something we need to hide, we see it as something we need to get rid of, and something that needs to be hidden and not shown. So that really leaves us in quite a problem, because when we have grief, how are we going to be able to tell the story unless we're able to contact some of our sadness and work with that in some way? So really, sadness has got a bad name in our culture, and it's seen as toxic, and this creates real trouble for grieving people and for just anyone. You know, in the Dagura tribe in Africa, they see the tears of grief as being fuel for the person who died to move to that next level of spiritual development. So they see the grief as being something that is worthy and something that has meaning, something that needs to be done in order to help. It's a helpful thing. And when the people from the Dagura tribe have come to this country, they scratch their heads and they think, why are people not grieving? Why are people at funerals just standing there? It says it doesn't make any sense to them. Gosh, at the Dagura funeral, and we'll be talking about this, but they have dancing, they have all kinds of ways to move that sadness out of the body, out of the psyche, and into the place where it can be helpful to the people who have just died. So God bless the Dagura. We'll be talking more about them as we go along. But sadness basically is a problem for us. And, you know, the ages, throughout the ages, the poets have helped us understand what this thing called sadness is. And this philosophers, too, is a man named Trungpa, who is one of my favorite authors. And old Trungpa used to talk about the experience of sadness and that fullness of heart that develops from that sadness, and how that is a part of being human. Really, you can't be a developed, mature, human individual unless you can sit in that experience and be that for a while. And that's really what we want to do. When we listen to people's story about sadness, we're letting them be in that for a while. We're telling them, you know, that's okay. That's all right. You can be in that for a while. Okay, the last reaction to grief we're going to talk about is guilt. And this is a tricky one, because guilt is not an emotion. Guilt is not a feeling. Guilt is a way of thinking. It's very different. You know, both sadness and anger and anxiety all have their own breath. You can tell when someone is feeling that by the way they breathe. And you can basically palpate that by breathing in that way. But guilt is not like that. Guilt is not like that at all. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking about something that turns things back on ourselves and makes us the enemy in some way or another. So before, what we do with the sadness and the anger is to steward that space and to help people to breathe through that and to let that stuff go through repeated tellings and to honor them in that space. But if you do that with guilt, what are you doing? You're basically going to make the guilt worse. Because, you know, the guilt doesn't go away with repeated tellings. It doesn't go away by telling the story of the guilt. It's not an emotion. It's not that at all. It's a flawed manner of thinking. And so it requires us to take a little bit of a different stance. And we don't want to get too negative with the guilt, but you do want to help people bring them back to the point where they see that guilt is not really focusing on what's real and what's happening. Now, you know, there is such a thing as good guilt. You know, good guilt is if I got arrested for drunk driving and I felt bad about that, bad enough so that I stopped drinking altogether or stopped driving while I was impaired, then maybe guilt would be a good thing. So guilt is not always bad. The guilt we're talking about is what you see oftentimes in grief, when people will feel guilty about something that really is not connected to reality. And I like to talk about guilt as being a way to put today's knowledge on yesterday's problems. Does that make sense? You put what you know today, you know all kinds of things today, and you try and put that on the problems of yesterday. I should have known this, I should have known that, etc., etc., etc. Guilt is putting today's knowledge on yesterday's problems. And the more we can help people see that, just gently bring them back, say, oh, you know what, you didn't know that then. You didn't know that that was, if you'd known, oh gosh, this guy who bought his son a car, and the car was a nice car, but it was flimsy. And the son was killed in the car. And the father just was berating himself terribly. If only I'd bought him a tank, a 58 Buick, you know, something that was so heavy that if something hit it, it wouldn't even dent. But you see, he didn't know when he bought the car that his son was going to die in the accident. He had no idea. If he'd known that the son was going to die, he would have bought him a Sherman tank. He would have gotten him anything, a Panzer, whatever. But he didn't know that then. So he's putting today's knowledge on yesterday's problems, and that's something to keep an eye on. The most important thing about the guilt is that we don't treat it like the other emotions, because guilt is not an emotion, it's a way of thinking. Okay, so we've talked about all kinds of things here. We've talked about, start off with safety, and how safety is critical and how we need to do that for folks. And then once the safety is there, we tell the story. We're able to tell the story, and then the three different ways you tell the story is through either interaction, action, or inaction. And then the things that get processed as the story is told, we talked about the anger and the sadness, and then a little bit about the guilt. And we'll be going into much greater detail on particularly the active, interactive, and inactive pieces with all kinds of examples. And if you have questions, we can talk about it in our time together, and that'll do it for now.